For 2 decades, a span of time that now felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly fleetingly brief, I, Clara Hayes, had meticulously, lovingly, and with an almost unwavering, if sometimes undeniably weary devotion, played the role of the perfect wife. The devoted mother, the silent, unassuming, and largely unacknowledged cornerstone of what I genuinely, blissfully, and as it would soon be, devastatingly revealed to my very core, entirely erroneously perceived to be a happy, prosperous, and entirely unshakable family. My husband, Victor Hayes, was a man of considerable and ever-increasing ambition, and by all outward appearances to our friends, our neighbors, and indeed to his own admiring, often fawning extended family, a man of equally considerable and ever-escalating success in the competitive, high-stakes, and often ruthless world of financial investment. We lived, or rather he provided, and I, with my own more modest contributions, maintained a sprawling, tastefully decorated, and reassuringly expensive home in one of the city's most affluent, picturesquely tree-lined, and socially desirable suburban enclaves. A tangible, almost ostentatious testament, I had always believed to his relentless hard work, his undeniable business acumen, and our shared mutually beneficial and deeply prosperous future. Our 2 children, 16-year-old Olivia, a budding talented artist with my own quiet introspective sensitivity and a disconcerting knack for seeing through adult pretensions, and 13-year-old Daniel, a boisterous sports-mad and endearingly goofy whirlwind of boundless, inexhaustible energy, whose infectious, unrestrained laughter could and often did fill our entire spacious home with an almost tangible, effervescent joy. Where I believed with every fiber of my maternal being thriving in this carefully constructed environment of material comfort, perceived emotional security, and seemingly endless, boundless opportunity. They attended the right schools, participated in the right extracurricular activities, wore the right clothes, and generally, or so I had convinced myself, wanted for nothing. I, in turn, had willingly, almost eagerly, and with a societal and familial expectation that was in those earlier, more naive years of our marriage, largely unexamined and entirely unquestioned by myself, embraced the traditional, if increasingly anachronistic in the wider world role of the supportive stay-at-home wife and devoted, ever-present mother. My own earlier, more modest, but nonetheless deeply cherished career aspirations, a burgeoning talent for botanical illustration, a quiet passion that had once filled my sketchbooks and my solitary hours with a profound, almost spiritual sense of creative fulfillment, had been gently, lovingly, yet with a certain undeniable and ultimately rather suffocating finality set aside like a collection of pressed, faded wildflowers in a long-forgotten leather-bound scrapbook. They were relegated to the dusty, seldom-visited attic of my heart, a quiet sacrifice made. I had always told myself, and indeed often proudly proclaimed to others, on the noble, unassailable altar of family, of motherhood, of my unwavering commitment to Victor's brilliant, demanding, and all-consuming career. I managed our household, that sprawling, beautiful, and increasingly impersonal testament to Victor's escalating financial success, with a quiet, almost invisible, yet relentlessly meticulous efficiency. I ensured our home was always immaculate, a haven of order and tranquility, to which he could retreat after his long, stressful, and invariably critically important days at the firm. Our meals, even the everyday ones, were always nutritious home-cooked and presented with a certain understated elegance, a skill I had honed over years of practice and a genuine, if largely unacknowledged love for the art of homemaking. Our children's myriad school commitments, their complex schedules of extracurricular activities, Olivia's advanced placement art classes and private cello lessons, Daniel's travel soccer team practices and weekend debate club tournaments were always perfectly, seamlessly, and almost magically orchestrated, their clean uniforms always ready, their permission slips always signed their transportation, always arranged their emotional well-being. Or so I had desperately, fervently hoped. Always my paramount and successfully navigated concern. I was in essence the ever-present, ever-attentive, ever-accommodating, and almost entirely unpaid chief operating officer, of the increasingly complex and often emotionally demanding domestic enterprise known as the Hayes family. And I performed my duties for many, many years without complaint, without resentment, fueled by a deep, abiding love for my husband and children, and by a perhaps outdated but nonetheless deeply ingrained belief in the sanctity, the importance, the inherent nobility of my chosen sacrificial role. My belief in the sanctity of family, in the unshakable, unconditional nature of those sacred bonds, was not just a romantic notion. It was the very bedrock of my existence, the moral compass that guided my every action, my every decision. I had been raised in a close-knit, if not particularly affluent family myself, a family where loyalty, mutual support, and a deep, abiding sense of interconnectedness were not just preached, but actively, consistently practiced. My own parents, now sadly deceased, had weathered their own share of life's inevitable storms. Financial hardships, health scares, personal disappointments, but they had always faced them together. Their love for each other, their commitment to their children, an unyielding, unwavering constant that I believed with every fiber of my being was the true meaning of family. That was the legacy I was determined to uphold, to pass on to Olivia and Daniel. And so I poured all my energy, all my love, all my hopes into creating not just a beautiful house, but a true home, a sanctuary where Victor could unwind from the relentless pressures of his high-powered career, a place where Olivia and Daniel could feel safe, nurtured, unconditionally loved, and entirely free to explore their own burgeoning talents, their own unique individual paths. I orchestrated elaborate, joy-filled birthday celebrations for the children, meticulously planned memorable family vacations, often to less exotic, more budget-friendly destinations than Victor's colleagues might have chosen, but always filled, I ensured, with laughter, adventure, and a wealth of shared happy memories. I patiently mediated the inevitable, often volatile sibling squabbles between a fiercely artistic, introspective Olivia and a boisterously competitive, sports-obsessed Daniel. I was the keeper of family traditions, the weaver of shared memories, the silent, steadfast emotional glue that I believed held our entire precious family unit together, strong, resilient, and unshakable. I genuinely, blissfully believed that Victor, despite his increasing preoccupation with his career, despite his occasional stress-induced irritability, despite his sometimes frustrating emotional distance, shared this fundamental belief in the paramount importance of family, of our shared life, of our mutual commitment. He would often, in moments of uncharacteristic and therefore all the more precious tenderness, perhaps after a particularly successful business deal, or during a quiet, fire-lit evening after the children were asleep, pull me close, his voice husky with an emotion I so desperately wanted to believe was genuine, and murmur, "You're amazing, Clara. You're the heart of this family. I don't know what I'd do, what we'd do without you. You hold us all together." And those words, those rare, cherished crumbs of acknowledgement, of appreciation, would be enough. Enough to refuel my weary spirit, to reaffirm my commitment to silence, at least for a little while, the faint nagging whispers of my own long-deferred personal aspirations, the almost imperceptible yet undeniably present ache of a part of myself that had been for so very long, so willingly, so lovingly, yet so completely set aside. My faith in him, in us, in the unshakable sanctity of our family was, I believed, absolute. The illusion of our idyllic, prosperous, and entirely secure family life, an illusion I had so meticulously, so lovingly, so naively cultivated for nearly 2 decades, began to unravel, not with a gradual warning tremor, but with the sudden, shocking, and entirely unforeseen brutality of a catastrophic earthquake, an earthquake whose epicenter was, to my initial bewildered disbelief, my husband, Victor Hayes himself. It all began, as so many life-altering calamities do, on an otherwise entirely unremarkable Tuesday morning in early spring, a morning that dawned bright, clear, and filled with the deceptive promise of ordinary, everyday contentment. Victor had left for his downtown office even earlier than usual, a sheaf of important-looking documents clutched in his hand, muttering something about a critical make-or-break presentation to a new, potentially hugely lucrative international client. I had wished him luck, as I always did, offering him a quick, affectionate kiss. As he rushed out the door, my mind already turning to the familiar, comforting rhythms of my own domestic day. School lunches, to pack household chores, to attend to a grocery list to compile. There was absolutely nothing, no premonition, no subtle shift in his demeanor, no lingering unspoken tension in the air to suggest that this day, this seemingly ordinary Tuesday, would be the day our carefully constructed world would begin to irrevocably, devastatingly implode. The first jarring intimation of trouble arrived not via a dramatic phone call or a hushed, worried conversation, but in the cold, impersonal, and entirely unexpected form of a certified letter delivered by a grim-faced, official-looking courier just before lunchtime. The return address I noted with a flicker of mild, uncomprehending curiosity was that of Sterling and Finch, a prestigious and notoriously aggressive corporate law firm I vaguely recognized from the city's financial pages, a firm certainly not on our usual list of correspondents. With a sense of mild, almost detached puzzlement, I signed for the envelope, and after settling onto the kitchen stool with a hastily poured cup of tea began to open it. The contents, however, were anything but mundane, anything but routine. They were a formal, legally binding, and utterly comprehensively devastating notice of intent to initiate foreclosure proceedings on our beloved Maple Street home. Our home. The home that was, according to every document I possessed, every assurance Victor had ever given me, owned outright, free and clear, a testament to my grandmother's legacy and our years of supposed financial prudence. My mind reeled. Foreclosure. It was impossible. Preposterous. There had to be some terrible, egregious mistake. A clerical error. Perhaps the letter was intended for another Hayes family, another unfortunate soul on another less fortunate Maple Street. We had no outstanding mortgage on this house. We had paid it off years ago, or rather, the substantial down payment from my inheritance had covered the vast majority, and Victor, with his astute investments, he had always proudly, repeatedly assured me, cleared the remaining insignificant balance within the first few years of our ownership. This simply couldn't be happening. But the letter, with its cold, hard, and terrifyingly specific legal jargon, its official court seals, its undeniable, ominous authenticity, told a different, far more sinister story. It detailed with a chilling, almost clinical precision, a series of substantial undeclared and now critically delinquent second and even third mortgages that had apparently been taken out against our property over the preceding 18 months, mortgages I had absolutely no knowledge of, had certainly never signed for, had never ever consented to. The total outstanding debt, the letter starkly, brutally informed me, was a staggering, almost unimaginable sum. A sum that far, far exceeded the current market value of the property itself. A sum that we as a family had absolutely no conceivable means of repaying. And the primary signatory on all of these clandestine, ruinous loan agreements, Victor Hayes, my husband. The teacup slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering with a sharp, discordant crack on the pristine, polished tiles of my beloved kitchen floor, the spilled tea spreading like a dark, ominous stain, a perfect, terrible metaphor for the sudden, violent, and entirely unexpected shattering of my own, once so perfect, once so secure world. I remember sinking onto the floor amidst the shards of broken china, the damning legal document clutched so tightly in my hand that my knuckles were white, my breath coming in short, ragged, insufficient gasps, my mind a chaotic, screaming vortex of disbelief, of confusion, of a dawning, sickening, and utterly terrifying horror. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of grotesque, elaborate, and incredibly cruel practical joke. But the cold, hard, legalistic print on the page before me was undeniable. And the implications, the devastating, life-altering implications, were beginning to crash down upon me with the force of a physical, almost unbearable blow. Our home, our sanctuary. The only stable home Olivia and Daniel had ever known, the home that held all our precious family memories, was about to be taken from us. We were, it seemed, on the very brink of financial ruin, of homelessness. And my husband, Victor, The man I had trusted with my life, with my children's future, with everything I held most dear, had, it appeared, not only lied to me, deceived me, betrayed me on a scale so monumental, so profound, it was almost impossible to comprehend, but he had also, with a cold, calculated, and almost sociopathic recklessness, single-handedly and entirely secretly gambled away our entire family's financial security, our children's inheritance, our very future. The initial shock, the paralyzing numbness, soon gave way to a rising tide of frantic, almost hysterical panic. I had to reach Victor. I had to understand. There had to be an explanation. A terrible, perhaps, but surely some kind of explanation for this madness, this utter, incomprehensible betrayal. My increasingly desperate, frantic phone calls to his office, to his cell phone throughout that agonizing, endless afternoon, all went unanswered, each unanswered ring, a fresh, agonizing stab of fear, of dread in my already bleeding heart. His usually so efficient, so unflappable secretary, when I finally, in a state of near hysteria, managed to get through to her, sounded, flustered, evasive, claiming Mr. Hayes was in a critically important, uninterruptible, all-day meeting with international clients, and could not, under any circumstances, be disturbed. A lie. I knew it was a lie. Just like everything else, it seemed, in my carefully constructed and now so horrifically, so comprehensively unraveling life. He finally, belatedly sauntered through our front door late that evening, long after Olivia and Daniel, their faces etched with a worried, uncomprehending confusion at their mother's uncharacteristic, almost visible distress, had been fretfully, uneasily put to bed. He looked, I remember, with a chilling, almost preternatural clarity, entirely unnervingly normal. His expensive suit was as always immaculate. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed. He carried his usual overstuffed Italian leather briefcase in one hand, a look of weary, self-important end of a long, hard day at the office martyrdom already settling onto his handsome patrician features. He offered me his usual perfunctory, almost absent-minded peck on the cheek, his mind clearly already elsewhere on his after-dinner scotch, on the financial pages of the evening newspaper, on anything, it seemed. But me, his distraught, terrified, and silently, almost volcanically imploding wife. I didn't waste time on pleasantries, on accusations, on tears, though God knows a torrent of them was threatening to erupt from me at any moment. I simply wordlessly handed him the damning, crinkled, tea-stained foreclosure notice from Sterling and Finch. He took it, his brow furrowing in feigned, almost bored puzzlement. He glanced at it casually at first, then with a dawning, almost comical look of theatrical surprise. Well, he said, his voice a masterpiece of feigned, light-hearted incredulity. What have we here? Sterling and Finch, eh? Bit aggressive. Aren't they for a simple refinancing query? Must be some sort of rather unfortunate bureaucratic mix-up at their end, darling. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I'll have my lawyers sort out this silly little misunderstanding first thing in the morning. Honestly, the incompetence of some of these financial institutions these days, it's simply breathtaking. And then he did something that even now, even after all these years, still has the power to make my blood run cold, to fill me with a rage so profound, so visceral, it almost chokes me. He chuckled, a light, airy, almost dismissive chuckle. As if the imminent, catastrophic loss of our family home, the devastating revelation of his profound, multi-layered betrayal, was nothing more than a silly little misunderstanding, a tedious bureaucratic mix-up, an amusing, if slightly inconvenient anecdote to be recounted later, with a self-deprecating shrug at his exclusive members-only golf club. In that single, chilling, utterly revelatory moment, something within me, something that had perhaps been slowly, painfully dying for years, finally, irrevocably snapped. The naive, trusting, endlessly accommodating Clara Hayes, the woman who had loved him, supported him, sacrificed for him for nearly 2 decades, ceased to exist. And in her place, a different woman, a stranger, even to myself, began with a terrifying, almost exhilarating clarity to emerge. A woman forged in the crucible of profound betrayal. A woman steeled by a mother's fierce protective fury. A woman who was finally blessedly and entirely unapologetically done. Done with his lies. Done with his manipulations. Done with his casual, soul-destroying cruelty. Done with him. The perfect marriage had not just shattered, it had in that single chilling revelatory instant been utterly comprehensively and irrevocably annihilated. And the battle for my children's future, for my own survival, for some semblance of justice in a world suddenly rendered so terrifyingly, so brutally unjust, was about to begin. The days and then weeks that immediately followed Victor's chillingly casual, almost sociopathically dismissive reaction to the foreclosure notice. His infuriating attempt to gaslight me to paint the impending catastrophic loss of our family home as a mere, silly little misunderstanding were without a shadow of a doubt the darkest, most desolate, most emotionally eviscerating period of my entire, hitherto relatively sheltered existence. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted with every fiber of my being, the man with whom I had built a life, a family, a future, was not just a reckless spendthrift, not just an incompetent financial manager. He was, it was now agonizingly, undeniably clear, a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless liar, a man capable of a betrayal so profound, so multifaceted, it almost defied comprehension. My initial, almost catatonic shock, the sheer, unadulterated disbelief at the enormity of his deceit, slowly, insidiously began to give way to a far more corrosive, far more debilitating constellation of emotions. There was grief, of course, a profound, almost unbearable grief for the loss of my marriage, for the shattering of my illusions, for the irretrievable death of the man I thought I knew, the life I thought I had. There was anger, a searing, righteous fury that simmered just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed composure, an anger directed not just at Victor, but also with a painful, almost masochistic intensity at myself, at my own naivete, my own willful blindness, my own foolish, unquestioning trust that had perhaps even in some small, unacknowledged way, enabled his years of deception. And then there was fear, a cold, gnawing, all-consuming fear for the future, for my children's future, for our very survival in a world suddenly rendered so hostile, so precarious, so terrifyingly uncertain. Victor, in the immediate aftermath of our non-confrontation, if one could even call his dismissive monologue, and my stunned, horrified silence. A confrontation did not, as I had perhaps on some deeply buried, still, naively hopeful level anticipated he might offer any further explanation, any semblance of remorse, any attempt at genuine reconciliation or problem-solving. Instead, he retreated. He retreated into a wall of icy, impenetrable silence, into even longer, more frequent absences from our now chillingly tense, almost funereal home. He would leave before the children woke return, long after they were asleep, his movements furtive, his explanations for his whereabouts, when offered, at all vague, dismissive, almost contemptuous. It was clear, avoiding me, avoiding the inevitable, agonizing reckoning, hoping perhaps in his monumental arrogance and his pathological denial that if he simply ignored the problem, ignored me, ignored the devastating reality of our impending financial ruin, it would all somehow magically disappear. His family, the affluent, influential, and always so impeccably, almost intimidatingly respectable Hayes clan, his stern, emotionally distant surgeon father, Richard Sr., son, his socially ambitious and often subtly, cruelly critical mother, Patricia, His two younger, equally self-absorbed and status-conscious siblings, Stephen, the perennially between-ventures entrepreneur, and Caroline, the thrice-divorced socialite, whose primary occupation seemed to be the acquisition of expensive handbags and the dissemination of malicious gossip, were in this time of my profound, almost unbearable personal crisis, not a source of comfort, of support, of familial solidarity, as one might naively or perhaps contractually expect. No, they were instead a united, formidable, and utterly unsympathetic phalanx of denial, of victim-blaming, of unwavering, almost cult-like loyalty to their precious golden boy Victor, who in their collective willfully blind perception could quite simply do no wrong. When I, in a moment of desperate, almost suicidal courage, finally managed to stammer out the horrifying truth of Victor's financial betrayals of the impending foreclosure on our home to Patricia, my mother-in-law, during a strained obligatory Sunday afternoon tea at their palatial and now suddenly so mockingly opulent estate, her reaction was not one of shock or sympathy or even maternal concern for her own son's clearly self-destructive behavior. Instead, it was one of cold, dismissive, and thinly veiled accusation. "Clara, dear," she'd said, her voice dripping with an icy, condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl, her perfectly manicured fingers delicately adjusting the pearls at her throat. "Are you quite sure you've understood the situation correctly? Victor is such a brilliant, astute financial mind. Perhaps you've simply misinterpreted some complex investment strategy, or perhaps," she'd added, her gaze flicking dismissively over my own clearly less expensive attire, "perhaps you've been a little extravagant in your own household spending lately, my dear." And Victor, in his usual kind and entirely too generous way, is simply trying to shield you from the unfortunate but entirely predictable consequences. Her words, her blatant, almost sociopathic refusal to even consider the possibility of her son's culpability, her insidious attempt to shift the blame, the responsibility onto me, the victim of his profound, multifaceted deceit, were like another vicious, twisting stab to my already bleeding, fractured heart. I realized then with a chilling, devastating certainty that I was utterly, comprehensively alone in this. There would be no help, no sympathy, no support forthcoming from the Hayes family. They would close ranks. They would protect their own. They would, if necessary, sacrifice me and my children on the altar of their precious family name. Their carefully constructed facade of unshakable respectability and effortless affluence. The days that followed were a descent into a deeper, darker, and more terrifying abyss of isolation and despair than I had ever in my most pessimistic imaginings thought possible. I was a pariah in my own marriage, a stranger in my own home, an outcast from the family I had for 2 decades tried so hard, so earnestly to be a part of. The weight of Victor's betrayal compounded by his family's callous, unyielding denial, and my own profound, almost paralyzing sense of shame and failure. For how could I have been so blind, so foolish, so utterly comprehensively wrong about the man I had loved? The life I had built threatened to crush me, to extinguish the last flickering embers of my own will, to fight my own desire to even continue. I remember nights spent weeping silently into my pillow so as not to wake the children, my body racked with a grief so profound, so all-consuming, it felt as though a vital part of my very soul had been violently, irrevocably ripped away. I remember days spent wandering through our beautiful, sun-drenched and soon-to-be-lost home in a kind of numb, disbelieving daze. Every familiar object, every cherished photograph, every lovingly tended rosebush in the garden, now a poignant, painful reminder of a life that was no longer real, a future that had been so cruelly, so casually stolen from us. I barely ate. I barely slept. I felt myself, my very essence, beginning to unravel, to fray at the edges like an old, discarded piece of once beautiful, now hopelessly tattered tapestry. But then, amidst the overwhelming darkness, amidst the suffocating despair, a tiny, almost imperceptible, yet surprisingly resilient flicker of something else began to stir within me. It was the memory of my own mother, a woman of immense quiet strength, a woman who had faced her own share of life's adversities, widowhood, financial hardship, illness, with an unwavering, indomitable courage, with a fierce, unshakable belief in her own ability to not just endure, but to prevail. I remembered her words spoken to me so often during my own more trivial childhood and adolescent crises, words that now in this moment of my profound adult despair resonated with a new, almost sacred urgency. "Clara, my darling girl," she would say, her voice calm, her gaze steady, her hand a warm, reassuring presence on mine. "Life will inevitably and often knock you down. It will test you. It will break your heart. That is its nature. But it is not the falling that defines you, my love. It is the rising. It is the courage to get back up, to dust yourself off, to face the storm, and to somehow, someway find the strength, the grace to keep on fighting for yourself, for those you love, for what you know, deep in your soul, to be right, to be true." And then there were my children. Olivia, my bright, perceptive, and increasingly heartbreakingly anxious 16-year-old, who, though I had tried so desperately to shield her from the worst of it, clearly sensed the profound unspoken turmoil that had engulfed our home. Her usually so expressive artistic eyes now often clouded with a worried, questioning sadness that mirrored my own. And Daniel, my boisterous, usually so carefree 13-year-old son, who had become uncharacteristically quiet, subdued, his infectious laughter once, a constant joyful sound in our home, now a rare, almost hesitant echo. They were watching me. They were depending on me. And I knew with a certainty that cut through the fog of my own despair like a sharpened, unwavering blade that I would not let them down. I would not allow Victor's betrayal, his family's cruelty, my own momentary understandable weakness to define their future, to shatter their innocent belief in the possibility of goodness, of justice, of a life lived with dignity, with security, with love. And so, from the very depths of that abyss, from the smoldering ashes of my shattered illusions, a new, unfamiliar, and surprisingly potent resolve began ever so slowly, ever so painfully to emerge. The tears, though still present, began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard, diamond-edged anger, an anger that was not just destructive, but also, I was beginning to realize, strangely, unexpectedly empowering. The despair, though still a dull, aching companion, was no longer paralyzing. It was instead beginning to transform into a fierce, almost primal determination. A determination to fight, a determination to survive, a determination to not just reclaim what had been so cruelly, so unjustly stolen from us, but to build something new, something stronger, something entirely, wonderfully, and unapologetically our own. My first and most crucial act of this nascent, fragile rebellion against the tyranny of Victor's deceit and my own crippling despair was to finally definitively acknowledge the full, unvarnished, and utterly devastating truth of my situation. My marriage was over. My husband was a liar, a thief, a betrayer of the most sacred, most fundamental human trusts. My home, my financial security, my children's future were all in grave, imminent jeopardy. And I, Clara Hayes, was utterly, comprehensively, and terrifyingly alone in this fight. Or was I? No, I realized with a sudden clarifying surge of adrenaline. I was not entirely alone. I had my children, my unwavering motivation, my sacred responsibility. I had the memory, the enduring legacy of my own mother's indomitable strength. And I had myself, my own intellect, however long suppressed, my own resilience, however deeply buried, my own now fully awakened and entirely righteous fury. And I remembered with a jolt, one other potential and perhaps invaluable ally, Ms. Anya Sharma, the formidable dragon-slaying lawyer my friend had so presciently, so providentially recommended to me all those years ago, a recommendation I had at the time, in my naive marital bliss, so casually, so foolishly dismissed. It was time, I knew with a certainty, that was as cold and hard as it was liberating to make that call. It was time to stop being a victim. It was time to start being a warrior. The quiet, unassuming, and so long so cruelly underestimated Clara Hayes was about to find her voice, her strength, her unshakable, indomitable will. And Victor Miller and his entire complicit, arrogant family were about to discover to their profound and everlasting regret just how dangerous, just how formidable a woman, a mother with absolutely nothing left to lose and everything, absolutely everything to fight for, could truly be. The game, their cruel, manipulative, one-sided game, was about to change. Dramatically and irrevocably. The decision to contact Miss Anya Sharma, the almost mythical legal warrior my friend had spoken of with such reverence, was not just a practical step. It was a profound symbolic act of reclaiming my own agency, of consciously, deliberately choosing to transform myself from a passive, bewildered victim of Victor's treachery into an active, determined protagonist in my own unfolding drama of survival, and I hoped eventual justice. The initial consultation secured after a nerve-wracking week of persistent, almost desperate phone calls to her notoriously selective and impeccably well-guarded law firm was in itself an almost out-of-body experience. Ms. Sharma's opulent, art-filled top-floor office with its panoramic, almost intimidating views of the city skyline felt like a world away from my own small, cluttered, and suddenly so very precarious suburban existence. She was in person even more formidable, even more immediately impressively commanding than her already considerable, almost legendary reputation had suggested. A woman in her late 50s, perhaps, though her age, like so much else about her, seemed almost impossible to determine with any certainty. She possessed piercing, intelligent, and unnervingly, almost supernaturally perceptive dark eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing to see right through any pretense, any artifice, any attempt at dissimulation. Her silver-streaked, impeccably cut black hair was pulled back from her strong, unlined face into a severe, elegant chignon that seemed to brook no nonsense. She wore an exquisitely tailored, dark, charcoal gray power suit that radiated quiet, understated, yet utterly unmistakable, almost palpable authority. And she exuded an aura of calm, focused, almost preternatural self-assurance that was simultaneously deeply, profoundly intimidating and strangely, unexpectedly, almost inexplicably comforting to my own frayed, terrified maternal nerves. I laid out my story, my voice despite my most desperate, almost superhuman efforts to maintain a semblance of composure, trembling slightly, occasionally cracking, with a resurgence of raw, unadulterated, and deeply humiliating emotion. As I recounted the years of my misplaced, almost childlike trust in Richard, I realized I had reverted to calling him Richard in my narration, a small slip perhaps, but one that felt right. Somehow a subconscious distancing from the Victor I had once loved, the Victor who had so comprehensively betrayed me. I detailed the routine administrative papers he had so casually, so charmingly, so damnably duped me into signing 18 long months prior. I described my subsequent deeply unsettling discovery of the missing original property deeds, the mysterious, faceless corporate entity known as Miller Family Holdings, Inc., that now apparently held title to my inherited properties, my family home. I presented her with hands that still, despite my best, almost convulsive efforts, shook almost uncontrollably with my meticulously organized, if, admittedly, still somewhat amateurishly compiled, burgeoning folder of damning evidence. The photocopied, and I was now almost entirely, sickeningly certain, fraudulently obtained quitclaim deed. The annotated, highlighted bank statements that hinted at but did not yet fully reveal the illicit systematic flow of funds. The chillingly dismissive, almost sociopathically detached internal memo from Richard's own architectural firm, the one that so clearly, so damningly alluded to his impending professional and financial implosion. Everything I had thus far in my desperate, solitary, and often tear-fueled nocturnal quest for elusive truth managed to unearth. Ms. Anya Sharma listened intently, patiently, without a single solitary interruption, without a flicker of discernible emotion. No surprise, no shock, no pity, no judgment on her strong, intelligent, and remarkably unlined, almost ageless face. Her keen, perceptive, dark eyes remained fixed unwavering, unblinkingly on mine as I spoke her profound, unnerving silence, more probing, more insightful, more revealing of her formidable intellect than 1,000 softly spoken sympathetic questions could ever have been. When I had finally, exhaustedly, tearfully, and with a profound, almost shameful sense of utter, comprehensive vulnerability, finished my rambling, often incoherent, but entirely painfully heartfelt account of Richard's multifaceted, almost unimaginable betrayal. A long, contemplative, and, for me, almost unbearably pregnant silence filled the opulent, sun-drenched, and suddenly very, very quiet conference room. A silence broken only by the distant, muted, almost indifferent hum of city traffic far, far below, and by the frantic, almost audible pounding of my own terrified, expectant heart. Then she spoke. Her voice, when it finally deliberately came, was low, calm, almost surprisingly disarmingly gentle, yet imbued nonetheless with an undeniable, almost palpable undercurrent of steely, righteous, and deeply reassuring indignation, and a quiet, unshakable, and infinitely wonderfully welcome confidence. "Elena," she said, addressing me with a surprising, almost disarming, and instantly comforting intimacy by my first name. A small gesture that, nonetheless, in that moment, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "What you have described, what you have so courageously, so painstakingly begun to uncover, what your husband Richard Miller, and potentially, indeed, I would say almost certainly, his entire complicit family, have so callously, so systematically, so despicably perpetrated against you, against your children, against the very sanctity of your marriage and your shared financial future is not just a case of simple marital infidelity, though I suspect from the evidence you have presented regarding the offshore accounts and the unexplained lavish expenditures that too is almost certainly a component of this sordid, multifaceted betrayal. It is not even, Elena, a case of mere, if egregious, financial mismanagement, however catastrophic, however ruinous its consequences may be for you and your family." She paused, then, allowing her words their full terrifying, yet strangely almost exhilaratingly empowering import to sink in, to resonate deep within my battered, bruised, but now strangely reawakening soul. A small, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably fierce, almost predatory smile touched the corners of her otherwise stern, unyielding lips. "No. Elena," she continued, her dark, intelligent eyes now gleaming with a new, almost electrifying intensity, an intensity that sent a shiver, not of fear this time, but of a dawning, almost savage and entirely unfamiliar hope coursing like wildfire through my veins. "What we are looking at here, what your evidence so strongly, so compellingly, and so damningly suggests is a clear, systematic, sophisticated, and deeply disturbing pattern of calculated criminal financial fraud, of egregious, almost breathtaking breach of fiduciary trust, of blatant, unconscionable, and almost certainly prosecutable forgery, and of profound, ongoing, and entirely unequivocally actionable emotional and psychological abuse. This is not just a messy, unfortunate, albeit financially devastating divorce case, Elena. This is a declaration of war, a war they Richard Miller and his entire morally bankrupt clan so arrogantly, so contemptuously, so foolishly started, a war they clearly in their monumental, almost pathological arrogance believed you were too weak, too naive, too domesticated, too utterly comprehensively cowed by their wealth, their status, their perceived power to ever in your wildest dreams fight back against. She leaned forward, then her gaze locking onto mine with an almost hypnotic, unwavering intensity. They were, I assure you, Elena, with every fiber of my professional and indeed personal being, profoundly, catastrophically, and I predict very, very soon, and very, very publicly, mistaken. Her words, so powerful, so confident, so filled with an unshakable, almost righteous commitment to justice, were like a healing balm to my raw bleeding, and so long, so painfully silenced soul. They were a clarion call to arms, a validation of my deepest, most terrifying fears, and a profound, almost overwhelming affirmation of my own long dormant and now so fiercely, so urgently reawakened strength. In that single, transformative, and utterly unforgettable moment, in that sun-drenched, art-filled, top-floor law office high above the indifferent, bustling city, I felt something profound, something irrevocable shift within me. The crushing, debilitating fear, while still a lingering, shadowy presence in the farthest, darkest corners of my mind, was no longer paralyzing, no longer all-consuming. The profound, almost unbearable despair, though still a dull, aching, tender wound in the deepest recesses of my heart, no longer felt entirely, hopelessly overwhelming. They had been overshadowed almost entirely, miraculously eclipsed by a new, unfamiliar, and incredibly, wonderfully, almost dangerously empowering sense of hope, and by the dawning, exhilarating, and almost savage realization that I, Elena Ramirez, the quiet, unassuming, and so long, so cruelly, so systematically underestimated wife and mother, was no longer, not ever again going to be alone in this fight. I had a warrior, a veritable legal Boudica, a dragon slayer of almost mythical proportions, now firmly, unequivocally, and with a fierce, almost joyful determination in my corner. The labyrinth of lies, however dark, however convoluted, however terrifyingly complex, suddenly seemed navigable. The truth, however deeply, however skillfully, however desperately buried, however painfully, agonizingly elusive it had once seemed, now felt attainable, reachable, inevitable. The real battle, the one for true, meaningful justice, for tangible, significant restitution, for my children's stolen future, for my own hard-won and now fiercely, almost ferociously reclaimed dignity, was, I knew, with every fiber of my being about to begin. And for the very first time in what felt like an eternity of darkness, of despair, of almost unbearable loneliness, I, Elena Ramirez, actually, genuinely, and with a heart that was against all odds, beginning to cautiously, tentatively, yet undeniably sing with a new, fragile, but wonderfully, exhilaratingly resilient hope, believed with every ounce of my reawakened and now thoroughly righteously enraged soul that I might actually miraculously win. The subsequent weeks under Ms. Anya Sharma's brilliant, relentless, and often, quite frankly, intimidatingly demanding tutelage were nothing short of a crash course, a brutal, unforgiving, yet ultimately profoundly empowering immersion into the often murky, frequently treacherous, and always unforgiving realities of high-stakes, complex legal warfare. It was also simultaneously a profound, often painful, but ultimately deeply personally transformative education in my own, hitherto entirely unsuspected and surprisingly formidable capacity for resilience, for strategic analytical thinking, for unwavering, almost obsessive and laser-like attention to the smallest, most seemingly insignificant of details. Ms. Sharma and her hand-picked elite team of razor-sharp, deeply experienced forensic accountants, of discreet, almost invisible private investigators. Yes, she had, as I had suspected her own, even more discreet, even more frighteningly effective, and considerably more expensive. Ms. Albright, it seemed, on permanent high retainer, and of fiercely intelligent, terrifyingly ambitious, and reassuringly loyal young legal associates descended upon Richard Miller's tangled, duplicitous, and as it turned out, remarkably fragile financial life, with the focused, merciless, and ultimately devastating intensity of a pack of highly trained, exceptionally well-resourced, and very, very hungry wolves. They subpoenaed with a speed and efficiency that was truly breathtaking to behold. Not just months, but years of his personal and business bank records, his investment statements from a bewildering array of obscure, often offshore brokerage firms, His voluminous credit card bills, which in themselves told a sordid, almost comical tale of profligate narcissistic spending, his meticulously detailed phone logs, his surprisingly revealing travel itineraries, even to my initial somewhat scandalized surprise, his confidential therapy records justified Miss Sharma explained with a chilling professional calm by the clear, demonstrable pattern of his pathological lying and manipulative behavior. They meticulously, painstakingly traced the convoluted, often deliberately, almost fiendishly obscured and deeply, profoundly incriminating flow of funds from our children's plundered college account, from my grandmother's violated precious inheritance, from our other systematically, almost surgically drained joint marital savings accounts. The money trail, once so cleverly, so arrogantly concealed by Richard, now led with an undeniable, irrefutable, and legally devastating clarity into his myriad hidden personal offshore bank accounts towards the bottomless, voracious, and ultimately entirely fictitious maw of his disastrous, and as it turned out, largely fabricated, personal ventures, and with a sickening, almost voyeuristic, and for me, still almost unbearably painful precision, directly, repeatedly, and with an almost celebratory extravagance into the eager waiting and undoubtedly very well manicured and equally culpable hands of his long-term and apparently very expensive mistress, the now infamous, at least within the rapidly expanding and increasingly horrified legal and financial circles of our city, Clarissa Dubois. The full, unvarnished, and utterly comprehensively devastating picture that emerged from their meticulous, painstaking, and often deeply personally intrusive investigation was even uglier, even more damning, even more comprehensively, almost unbelievably sociopathic than I, in my darkest, most cynical, and most paranoid moments, could ever have possibly remotely imagined. Richard Miller hadn't just been a foolish, reckless, and unlucky gambler who had made a few disastrous, impulsive, and ultimately forgivable financial mistakes, as I had perhaps in some deeply buried, still stubbornly hopeful corner of my shattered heart, tried to convince myself. He had. It was now undeniably, irrefutably, and with a clarity that was as liberating as it was terrifying. Clear been engaged in a long-term, systematic, sophisticated, and deeply morally repugnant campaign of deliberate, calculated, almost gleeful financial fraud. A fraud perpetrated not just against me, his wife of 20 years, the mother of his children, the woman who had loved and trusted him with an almost childlike, unquestioning devotion, but also, it now appeared with a sickening, widening horror against several of his own now former and entirely unsuspecting business partners who had also, it seemed, been victims of his charismatic charm and his Midas-like but ultimately entirely illusory financial promises. And even, it was now strongly chillingly rumored, based on certain deeply unsettling wiretapped conversations Ms. Sharma's investigators had, with a court order, managed to obtain against certain less than scrupulous and notoriously unforgiving offshore investors, individuals whose methods of debt collection were legendary for their brutality, their efficiency, and their utter chilling lack of any discernible human compassion. Our family home on Maple Street, the beautiful, beloved sanctuary that my grandmother's precious legacy had so significantly, so lovingly helped us to acquire, the home that I had poured so much of my heart, my soul, my very essence into creating, was not, it turned out, with a fresh, almost unbearable surge of nauseating, world-tilting panic in any immediate legal or direct danger of foreclosure from his myriad legitimate and now increasingly aggressive external creditors, as I had initially perhaps hysterically feared. No, Richard's diabolical plan, Ms. Anya Sharma explained to me with a grim, almost chilling and entirely professional admiration for its sheer, cold-blooded, almost breathtaking audacity, and its legal cunning had been far more insidious, far more permanent, far more personally devastating for me and for our children. The routine administrative papers, those seemingly innocuous documents he had so charmingly, so lovingly, so damnably duped me into signing without question, without scrutiny, all those long 18 agonizing months prior, the ones that had supposedly so benevolently streamlined our assets for tax efficiency and protected our family's future, had in fact been a complex, cleverly disguised and entirely fraudulent series of legal documents. Documents that had effectively and entirely without my informed genuine consent my signature Ms. Sharma's retained handwriting expert, now definitively, irrefutably confirmed, had been in several key critical instances a remarkably skilled but nonetheless demonstrable forgery, and in others obtained under demonstrably false, misleading, and coercive pretenses, transferred the sole, unencumbered, and absolute legal ownership of not just my precious inherited rental properties, but also, and most devastatingly, most unforgivably, our beloved Maple Street family home, our children's sanctuary, into the shadowy, impenetrable, and entirely exclusively Richard-controlled corporate entity known with a final mocking twist of the knife as Miller Family Holdings, Inc. He hadn't just mortgaged our home to the hilt behind my back to cover his ever-escalating ruinous debts, a betrayal that in itself would have been devastating enough. No. He had, in essence, with a breathtaking, almost sociopathic callousness, and with the clear, undeniable, and I now suspected long premeditated complicity of certain members of his own equally morally bankrupt family, stolen it from me, from our children, outright. He had legally, if entirely fraudulently, stripped us of our home, our security, our very sense of place in the world, leaving us in the eyes of the law with absolutely nothing but the clothes on our backs, the rapidly dwindling and now also likely frozen balance in our joint checking account, an account from which he was Ms. Sharma's ever-vigilant team quickly and with a grim satisfaction discovered still actively, almost daily, attempting to siphon funds, and a future that now looked not just uncertain but terrifyingly, almost unimaginably bleak. The sheer, cold-blooded, premeditated evil of his actions, the profound, almost unimaginable depth of his sustained, multi-layered betrayal, not just of our sacred marriage vows, but of his most fundamental, sacred paternal duty to protect, to provide for, to cherish his own innocent, unsuspecting children, left me, even now, even after all I had already endured, all I had already uncovered utterly comprehensively, almost catatonically speechless, with a fresh, searing, almost unbearable wave of horrified, incredulous, and soul-shattering disbelief. This wasn't just a cheating husband, a reckless, irresponsible gambler, a failed, desperate businessman. This was something else entirely. This was a monster. A calculating, manipulative, and utterly ruthless monster cloaked in the handsome, charming, and entirely deceptive disguise of the man I had once loved, the man I had once trusted, the man I had once so foolishly, so blindly, so devastatingly shared my life, my bed, my precious children with for nearly 2 long, wasted decades. The battle ahead. Ms. Anya Sharma cautioned me, her voice gentle now but still firm, still unwavering, would be long, arduous, and undoubtedly, incredibly, almost unimaginably emotionally taxing. Richard and his equally culpable and I now suspected entirely, almost eagerly complicit family, for how could they not have known on some fundamental, deeply disturbing level about his increasingly desperate, erratic financial machinations? His increasingly blatant, morally bankrupt behavior would fight us, she predicted with a grim, weary certainty, born of long, hard experience with every dirty, underhanded, and legally ambiguous, if not overtly illegal trick in their undoubtedly well-funded and entirely morally bankrupt playbook. They would try with a vicious, relentless intensity to discredit me, to defame me, to paint me as a bitter, vindictive, gold-digging, and emotionally unstable ex-wife. They would try with a callous, almost gleeful disregard for the emotional well-being of Olivia and Daniel to drag our innocent children into the messy public and deeply damaging vortex of their parents' acrimonious legal battle. They would try to delay, to obstruct, to exhaust my limited and rapidly dwindling financial resources to break my already so fragile, so battered emotional spirit. But they will not. I assure you, Elena, they will not succeed. Ms. Anya Sharma had concluded, her dark, intelligent eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering, and incredibly reassuring conviction that sent a fresh, desperately needed surge of renewed, almost defiant strength coursing like wildfire through my weary, battered, but now strangely, wonderfully re-energized soul. Because we, Elena, have something they, in all their wealth, all their influence, all their arrogance, do not. We have the truth, we have the undeniable, irrefutable evidence, and we have, my dear, a righteous, unshakable, and ultimately, I firmly, unequivocally believe, entirely unbeatable moral cause. Now she had smiled then, a rare, fleeting, but genuinely warm and incredibly encouraging smile. Let's go get back what is rightfully, legally, and morally yours. And let's make Richard Miller and anyone else, anyone at all who aided and abetted his despicable, unforgivable crimes, pay and pay dearly for every single solitary tear you have shed, for every sleepless, agonizing night you have endured, for every precious, innocent dream. They so callously, so cruelly, so despicably tried to steal from you and from your beloved, innocent children. And so armed with an irrefutable, meticulously documented and ever-expanding case file that now resembled a small but incredibly potent legal encyclopedia of marital and financial malfeasance, with a brilliant, fearless, and increasingly almost terrifyingly effective legal warrior by my very side, and with the fierce, unyielding, and entirely wonderfully righteous fury of a mother scorned, a wife betrayed, and a woman profoundly, unforgivably wronged. I, Elena Ramirez, stepped with a newfound, if still somewhat trembling courage out of the suffocating, paralyzing shadows of my grief, my fear, my crippling self-doubt, and into the harsh, unforgiving, but ultimately, I prayed with every fiber of my being, just and revealing arena of protracted high-stakes legal warfare. The intricate, insidious web of deceit, so carefully, so cunningly, so arrogantly woven by Richard Miller and his undoubtedly complicit accomplices, was about to be systematically, comprehensively, and very, very publicly unraveled thread by damning, incriminating thread. The reckoning so long overdue, so richly, so profoundly deserved, was at long, long last truly, and with an almost palpable, exhilarating momentum at hand. The legal battle that ensued, the one I had both dreaded and with a certain grim, righteous anticipation yearned for, was every bit as protracted, as brutal, as emotionally eviscerating, and as financially draining as Ms. Anya Sharma had so sagely, so accurately predicted. Richard Miller and his entire morally bankrupt family, true to form, fought us with a vicious, relentless, and often utterly shameless desperation, employing every dirty, underhanded, and ethically questionable legal tactic imaginable to delay, to obstruct, to intimidate, and to discredit. They filed a barrage of frivolous, time-wasting motions. They engaged in blatant, almost comical attempts at witness tampering. They launched a coordinated, insidious, and deeply personally wounding smear campaign against my character, my parenting, my very sanity through carefully leaked and artfully distorted, anonymous stories to the local gossip columns and online rumor mills, attempting to paint me as a bitter, vindictive, gold-digging, and emotionally unstable ex-wife, hell-bent on destroying a good, if perhaps somewhat flawed man, out of sheer, unadulterated spite. There were days, many, many days during that long 18-month legal ordeal when the sheer, unrelenting pressure of it all, the endless, intrusive depositions, the demeaning cross-examinations, the constant gnawing anxiety about our dwindling financial resources, the heartbreaking impact of the ongoing conflict on Olivia and Daniel, who, despite my best efforts to shield them, were inevitably painfully aware of the ugliness, the bitterness, the profound, fundamental fracturing of their family, felt almost too much to bear. There were moments when I felt on the very brink of complete, utter collapse, when the temptation to just give up, to walk away, to accept some paltry, insulting, out-of-court settlement, just to make the pain, the stress, the relentless, soul-crushing attrition stop was almost overwhelming. But then I would look at the hopeful, trusting faces of my precious children, I would remember the cool, unwavering confidence in Ms. Anya Sharma's intelligent, perceptive eyes. I would recall the profound, almost sacred sense of betrayal, the deep, burning, righteous anger that had first propelled me onto this arduous, unforgiving path. And a new, or rather a rediscovered surge of strength, of resilience, of sheer bloody-minded maternal determination would course through my weary, battered veins. I would not be broken. I would not be intimidated. I could not allow them to win, to get away with their monstrous, unforgivable crimes. And slowly, painstakingly, inexorably, with Ms. Sharma's brilliant, relentless legal maneuvering, with the undeniable, irrefutable weight of our meticulously gathered evidence, with the courageous corroborating testimony of Mr. David Chen and Ms. Sarah Thompson, who despite their own considerable personal risks and emotional pain, bravely, compellingly shared their own harrowing stories of Richard's past financial and emotional betrayals in open court. The tide of the legal battle began, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a gathering, undeniable momentum to turn in our favor. The turning point, the moment I knew, with a sudden exhilarating, almost disbelieving certainty that we were finally actually going to win, came during Richard Miller's own disastrous, almost comically inept cross-examination by Ms. Anya Sharma. Faced with her calm, incisive, and utterly relentless questioning, armed with his own damning financial records, his own incriminating emails, his own secretly recorded contradictory pronouncements, Richard's carefully constructed facade of injured innocence, of plausible deniability, of arrogant, dismissive self-assurance began to visibly, irrevocably crumble. He stammered. He contradicted himself. He prevaricated. He lied blatantly, repeatedly, and with an increasing, almost pathetic desperation until even his own high-priced legal team looked visibly, almost painfully embarrassed. He was in the harsh, unforgiving glare of that courtroom spotlight under the steady, unwavering, and increasingly skeptical gaze of Judge Harrison, not just unmasked. He was in a very real, very public, and deeply, profoundly satisfying way, utterly, comprehensively annihilated. The final judgment, when it was eventually, after what still felt like an eternity of agonizing, nail-biting deliberation, delivered by Judge Harrison, was everything Ms. Sharma had predicted, everything I had dared in my wildest, most hopeful dreams to imagine, and then some. It was a sweeping, comprehensive, and utterly unequivocally damning indictment of Richard Miller's and, by clear, if unspoken implication, his entire complicit family's sustained multi-year campaign of financial fraud, emotional abuse, and profound, almost sociopathic betrayal. The fraudulent quit-claim deed, the one that had so treacherously, so deceitfully stripped me of my inherited properties, and our beloved family home was declared null void and entirely unenforceable. A clear, undeniable product of demonstrable fraud, forgery, and undue manipulative influence. The full, unencumbered legal title to all of those properties, including our precious Maple Street home, was immediately and irrevocably restored to my name, solely with Richard Miller being explicitly and permanently barred from ever again asserting any claim, any interest, any right whatsoever to them. The children's plundered college fund, or rather the full documented $50,000 sum that had been so callously, so systematically embezzled from it, was ordered to be immediately and fully replenished by Richard Miller, and in a particularly satisfying and entirely just addendum from Judge Harrison by his parents Patricia and David Miller Sr., jointly and severally from their own still considerable, though now undoubtedly somewhat less ostentatious, personal assets. They, the judge, sternly noted as silent, non-beneficial partners in several of Richard's more dubious and clearly fraudulent personal ventures, and as individuals who had demonstrably and for years benefited from and willfully ignored his clear pattern of financial irresponsibility and deceit, shared a significant and undeniable degree of moral and now legal culpability. I was awarded without contest or further argument full, unassailable legal and primary physical custody of Olivia and Daniel. Richard Miller was granted only severely restricted professionally supervised and entirely at my, and more importantly, at the children's expressed and ongoing discretion visitation rights. Rights that were furthermore made explicitly and non-negotiably conditional upon him immediately enrolling in and diligently, verifiably, and successfully completing a comprehensive court-approved intensive program of psychological counseling for his clearly demonstrated pathological lying. His narcissistic personality disorder, a diagnosis Ms. Sharma's retained and highly respected psychological expert had, after a court-ordered and for Richard undoubtedly deeply humiliating evaluation, delivered with a chilling, unequivocal professional certainty, and his undeniable, destructive, almost compulsive addictive behaviors, whether they be financial recklessness, emotional manipulation, or serial unrepentant infidelity. And finally, in a move that sent a clear, unambiguous message, not just to Richard Miller, but to his entire arrogant and now thoroughly disgraced family, Judge Harrison awarded me a very substantial, almost unprecedented sum in punitive damages, a sum designed not just to compensate me for my own very real financial losses and profound emotional distress, but also, she stated with a stern, unwavering judicial authority, to serve as a clear, unequivocal, and very public deterrent against any such future egregious and morally bankrupt conduct. As Judge Harrison's final resounding gavel fell, a wave of emotion so profound, so overwhelming, so utterly comprehensively consuming washed over me that I thought for a fleeting, dizzying moment my legs might actually literally give way beneath me. Tears, hot, unrestrained, and entirely wonderfully cathartic, streamed down my face. Tears not of sadness, this time, not of anger, not of fear, but of immense, shuddering, almost unbearable relief, of hard-won, almost unbelievable justice, of a profound, soul-deep, and entirely wonderfully triumphant vindication. It was over. After all these years, after all the pain, all the betrayal, all the fear, all the struggle, it was finally, blessedly, irrevocably over. I had fought the battle of my life against a formidable, unscrupulous, and deeply personally wounding adversary, and I had against all odds, against all expectations, not just survived, but I had in every conceivable meaningful way won. The aftermath of that dramatic, life-altering courtroom victory was for me, Elena Ramirez, and for my precious children, Olivia and Daniel, a period of slow, painstaking, but ultimately deeply, profoundly rewarding reconstruction of healing, of rediscovering, and of rebuilding. The legal battles, though now largely concluded, had left their inevitable, indelible scars, not just on our finances, though. The court ordered restitution when it eventually, and with considerable ongoing legal pressure from Ms. Sharma, began to trickle in, certainly helped to alleviate the immediate pressing burdens, but far more significantly on our hearts, on our souls, on our fundamental, once so innocent perception of the world, of trust, of family. Richard Miller, stripped of his ill-gotten gains, his carefully constructed facade of success and respectability, now lying in irretrievable public ruins around him. His professional career in tatters, his social standing, obliterated his own family, or what little remained of their once so formidable united front. Now viewing him, I suspected with a mixture of shame, contempt, and a dawning horrified comprehension of the true monstrous extent of his pathological deceit, faded almost pathetically into a kind of self-inflicted, ignominious obscurity. His court-ordered supervised visitations with Olivia and Daniel were, as I had anticipated, sporadic, awkward, deeply uncomfortable, and ultimately, by the children's own quiet, increasingly adamant request as they grew older and understood more of the devastating truth of his betrayals, ceased almost entirely. He became in their young lives not a father, but a distant cautionary tale, a painful, almost mythical symbol of broken promises, of shattered trust, of a love that had proven to be not just conditional, but entirely devastatingly illusory. His family, the once so proud, so arrogant, so judgmental, Millers were by all accounts significantly humbled, their own social standing, their own carefully cultivated aura of effortless affluence and unshakable respectability, undeniably, and perhaps permanently tarnished by their close and now very public association with Richard's disgrace. Patricia Miller, my formidable, once so contemptuous mother-in-law, I encountered only once more by accident at a crowded downtown charity luncheon some years later. She looked older, smaller almost, defeated the icy arrogance in her pale blue eyes, replaced by a flicker of something that looked remarkably, almost shockingly like shame. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded room. She offered a small, hesitant, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, then quickly, almost furtively looked away. There were no words exchanged. None were needed. Her silent, almost invisible capitulation was in its own way a far more profound, far more satisfying admission of her own and her family's colossal moral defeat than any spoken apology could ever have been. For me, the journey was not about reveling in their downfall, not about exacting a pound of flesh, not about perpetuating a cycle of bitterness and resentment. My revenge, if one could even call it that, was far more constructive, far more life-affirming. It was in the quiet, daily, determined act of rebuilding my own life, of reclaiming my own narrative, of rediscovering my own long-suppressed artistic passions. I returned with a new, almost fierce sense of purpose to my textile art, my designs infused now with a depth of emotion, a raw, resilient strength, a complexity of texture and color that they had never before possessed, began to my surprise and delight to attract critical acclaim, then commercial success. My small home-based freelance business blossomed almost miraculously into a thriving, independent design studio, providing not just financial security for myself and my children, but also a profound, almost spiritual sense of personal accomplishment, of creative fulfillment of a life. My life finally, beautifully, and entirely, unapologetically lived on my own hard-won terms. And I taught my children Olivia and Daniel not through lectures, not through bitter recriminations against their absent, disgraced father, but through the quiet, consistent daily example of my own resilience, my own integrity, my own unwavering commitment to truth, to justice, to kindness, the invaluable life-altering lessons that had been so painfully, so brutally forged in the crucible of my own devastating betrayal. I taught them about the sacred, fragile nature of trust and the profound, lasting consequences of its violation. I taught them about the insidious, corrosive power of lies and the ultimate, liberating, redemptive power of truth. I taught them about the importance of financial independence, of self-respect, of never, ever allowing anyone, no matter how charming, no matter how powerful, no matter how beloved, to diminish their worth, to steal their dreams, to compromise their fundamental God-given right to a life filled with dignity, security, and genuine, authentic joy. In the end, the battle hadn't just been about a house, about money, about exposing a liar and a thief. It had been about reclaiming my soul. It had been about transforming the deepest, most agonizing pain of my life into my greatest, most empowering strength. It had been about proving not just to Richard Miller, not just to his arrogant, complicit family, not just to a skeptical, often judgmental world, but most importantly, most profoundly to myself, that I, Elena Ramirez, was not a victim. I was a survivor. I was a warrior. I was a phoenix risen, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more beautiful from the smoldering, bitter ashes of a devastating but ultimately so wonderfully, liberatingly survivable betrayal. And my new life, the one I had forged with my own two hands, with my own resilient heart, with my own unbreakable spirit, was by every conceivable, meaningful measure a masterpiece.